Okay, so let's talk a little bit about convention and orthodoxy. This is one of those topics that's halfway between doing your research because you've been looking at a lot of things and framing your problem, because we're going to use some conventions and orthodoxies that you identify to help frame solution directions. They're a real inspiration for finding better approaches to your problem. So I love this photo because it shows the sidewalk, going out over there. And when people have a need to break that convention, they find their own path. And the reason we introduce this in Catalyst is because we want you to be aware of those conventions and orthodoxies that your project is, bound by. And it goes all the way from your own individual conventions and assumptions, all the way up to industry, or kind of how the system thinks about these things. So let's talk about breaking those conventions or orthodoxies that aren't of much use to us and keep the ones that are helpful. So what's another example? So James Dyson looked at the vacuum cleaner, and the convention and the presumption was they have a bag, right? They have a bag that you have to replace depending on how often you vacuum and how dusty of an environment you have. Well, he was inspired by other vacuums he saw, and that didn't use a filter at all. Didn't use a filter bag. And this is a industrial wood shop type cyclone dust collector. And what he did was he took his desire to break that convention and make vacuum cleaners simpler, and he put a lot of technology to get that cyclone into the vacuum cleaner. Now he's they're the biggest vacuum manufacturer in the world. Side note, all the major vacuum cleaner manufacturers he went to originally just told him the idea won't fly, we're not interested. He was trying to sell it to one of the majors because he was just an engineer and a designer at that time trying to invent something. Anyway, he broke convention, and now all the other players have to kind of try to copy and be bagless as well. So breaking convention can be very powerful. Now, it just doesn't happen in the design of tangible things like products, but in organizations. And I don't know if you're familiar with W.L. Gore. They've invented Gore-Tex. They have all sorts of fabrics and high-performance materials. They also have things like guitar strings, which one of their associates, they call all of their employees associates, one of their associates started working on internally, slowly built momentum, and they brought that product to market. And they do a lot of things like that. Why? Because they broke the convention of having a hierarchical organization. And so they rejected that, the founders rejected that, a husband and wife team, by the way, and they created what they call a lattice organization or a networked organization. This is, decades ago, I think 30 or 40 years ago, decades and decades ago, they were questioning the organization of how people get work done. And what's really cool is, because of this, they have a bunch of principles. Anyone can speak to anyone. It's not like you have to go through reporting structures to have a conversation with somebody else in another department or anything like that. So they embody all these very different kinds of principles. You're encouraged to build your own network as a professional, as an associate at W.L. Gore, and they expect you to start to build relationships in whatever way you can. Not based on silo. And the leaders are actually elected by the associates. It isn't like the CEO and the silo leaders and managers are the only ones that promote people to leaders, but they're actually elected by the staff, by the associates. And I love this one. Meeting attendance is not mandatory. If you get invited to a meeting, you're supposed to evaluate whether it's worth your time. And you don't have to go if you think like, I'm not interested in that, I'm not interested in working on that. It's unclear what the goals would be. And of course you could shoot a note back and negotiate that with somebody as you try to make it more worth your time. But these are the kinds of things you do when you break convention, is you build and design a new way of doing things that is arguably more performant, or at least better for yourself. So, and then the case study I want to show is Defy Ventures. And what they do is they provide training for returning citizens coming out of prison, felons, who have entrepreneurial skills, and they help them get investment and build an entrepreneurial life. So let's watch a video here.
While touring prisons in Texas, former venture capitalist Catherine Hoke learned that 70% of the children of incarcerated people end up in prison too. She created Defy Ventures to break that cycle.
Many people out of prison cannot get a job. Employers don't want to hire somebody who has a criminal history. Yet so many incarcerated people are natural-born entrepreneurs. They just misdirected their skill sets to start illegal businesses. What would happen if they were equipped to go legitimately with their skills? Defy Ventures transforms the hustle of people with criminal histories. We start inside prison, we provide them with the skills and the tools and the network, and we reshape their thinking through a program called CEO of Your New Life. But it's not just entrepreneurship, it's also healing and personal growth and the character development. We want them to rise up to their full potential as entrepreneurs and as community leaders and as parents. Because of the history of extreme violence here, they were really worried about having more than 20 of their incarcerated men in the same space at any time. In this first graduating cohort across the 3 yards, we have about 80 guys, but now we're about to get to start serving 200.
All the inmates actually could come together of all different races, ethnic backgrounds, gang affiliations, and actually treat each other as equals, watching them hug each other, put stickers on each other's shirts, and cheer each other on. We had never seen that before here. I've seen tremendous changes in the inmates that are participating in it.
Today, we have their big finale, the business pitch competition, and then the graduation.
I am now motivated, passionate, and determined to start and run a successful business. I'm here today asking for a $20,000 investment in my food truck company, Infusion.
What I'm asking for today is $3,000 to add to my $32,000, my personal investment. They want that new and exciting alternative to what other catering services offer, and that is what I'm offering them with Homestyle. Thank you.
They have completed 100 courses, and today they're earning their Baylor University MBA program certificate. For some of those men, is the biggest accomplishment of their entire lives.
How cool is that? So it's very much a favorite case study of mine, especially in this notion of breaking conventions in terms of all the conventions that need to break up and down that example, including within the men who learn to work with each other instead of seeing each other as rivals, et cetera. So all the way to a prison system starting to open up and do productive activities and education and support of the incarcerated, which I'm very passionate about. So love that case study. Throw in the comments if you're watching this live what you find interesting about it. So what is convention? Convention is a way of doing something, or a way something is usually done, especially within a particular area or activity. So think about conventions as how we do things. And we've all heard the phrase, that's not how we do things around here, or this is how we do things around here, right? And so conventions you can think of are ways of doing. And then orthodoxies are much more related to mindset and belief. But remember that mindsets and belief, like we're working on in Catalyst, guide behavior. and decision making. So orthodoxy, tightly held beliefs that guide an organization's decision and their interpretation of new information. So we see conventions and orthodoxies behind them, or the belief systems behind them, all over the place. Classrooms set up in, teacher lecture, student don't move, pay attention, don't talk to your neighbor type environments, all the way to, if you rethink that, if you challenge those conventions, you start to bring the outside in, you group kids into collaborative pods so that they can work together to figure things out together, and you prioritize the teacher at the head of the class. You have banks that try to appeal to an old white character of wealth and investment and security, and you can change that by creating bank branches that cultivate learning about finance and supporting local entrepreneurs, business owners, and families, and make it more of a learning environment, as this one does in Barcelona, Spain. So the importance of identifying convention and orthodoxy is that lack of awareness of that they're at work can keep you from seeing potential opportunities, or actually allow the same forces that exist today to keep your solution from succeeding. So think about that. If you're not able to identify them, you might put a solution out there, but then what happens if that convention or the orthodoxy is the thing that keeps people's minds closed, keeps you from being able to achieve your solution? So it's really important. Conventions are stable, but the world is always changing, and it's changing faster than ever. Organizational memory is very faulty. You'll hear people inside your organization say how things are, and maybe somebody who's been there a longer time might think about that, look at that, or hear that, and go, I don't think we should be saying things like that. And in fact, I experienced that at my own company as we grew. I would see somebody giving somebody else advice and like, here's how we do it here. And I'd be like, no, we need to break these conventions and do it in a way that means it's successful. And new value creation often comes from identifying and breaking convention. So what are some ways to identify convention and orthodoxy? So certainly by bringing your beginner's mind and questioning things is a great start, being open to seeing that they exist. But the first step you can take is just with your team or yourself is just brainstorm a list of assumptions you have about your problem's context, your organization, partners, or how the industry works. Just brainstorm that list of assumptions with this notion of what do we take for granted? What do we think? How do we think things operate? And if you just brainstorm that list, you have a great start at seeing some of them that go, hey, we could question that one. You can search images and key phrases about your problem's context. And if you go through enough of those, your brain will start recognizing patterns and go, oh, everybody thinks about the problem in this way. And maybe we could think about it in a different way. But identifying patterns, so you have to expose yourself enough to many ideas, enough different ideas that you can find those patterns that underlie how people approach it. One thing I love is when we do interviews at organizations, when I start hearing the same rationale or the same story, the same history, repeated over and over through different people, I know that there's convention or orthodoxy at work. And so I look for those things what do we tell ourselves? What stories do we tell ourselves? What do we reinforce? And these things can also be negative reinforcements. Like we tell ourselves we don't have time to do something, or we tell ourselves, and just identifying those and then question, is that really true? Could I make that not true in some way? Is a great way to break through. Okay, and then the infamous childlike ask why 5 times. So when somebody gives you a rationale, you can say, why is that? And then they say, well, because of this, and you're like, and why is that? And why is that? And you do that 5 times, you usually get down to some potential root cause, or the rationale goes away and you're like, oh, well, maybe that isn't true. And we actually had an early catalyst do this in his own organization. It was about how they were administering a drug, and they said, we have to do it this way because the regulation is such and such and such and such. And he kept going, really? Is that how? Is that? It didn't make sense to him. And he kept asking, and it turns out somebody had interpreted the regulation wrong, and they've been telling themselves the wrong approach to the drug administration. So he got to the bottom of that story that they were all telling themselves, or that procedure, or that convention about how they do it. And then, just making sure you guys can see me. And then talking about how the world has changed and what you still do as an organization. So just looking at, what do we think is changing about the world relevant to our project? And then maybe how are we currently thinking about it, and could we think about it differently because of how things are changing? So those are some ways to identify convention and orthodoxy. Then so if you identify them, then you want to run a discussion or a collaborative cycle around which ones might be beneficial, which ones you might want to challenge, which ones might end up prove to be outdated. So from your brainstorming and discussion, make a final list of those conventions and orthodoxies. Have the teams or others outside of the team vote on ones you think are no longer relevant, should be challenged, we need more information about, right? Have people, I think this is important and might be an impediment to our project. Discuss the pros and cons of doing so. This isn't black and white, ever. It's almost like forcing yourself to say, what if we did, and what if we can't, or what if we shouldn't, or why shouldn't we, is a good back and forth to try to look at that convention in a way that allows you to break through it. And then identify 2 or 3 of them that you might want to have alternative ideas about, right? So you're not trying to break conventions across everything, because then maybe everything will break or it won't work. But find those ones that are most valuable or seem to be a large impediment to solving the problem in a way you'd like to solve it, and that you've heard from the people and stakeholders in your project. Okay, so that's convention and orthodoxy. I highly encourage your team to do a quick 30-minute, 40-minute cycle on this. It can be very fun. It can be funny. It can be surprising when you uncover something. We keep telling ourselves this. Why do we keep telling ourselves that? And it's a great way to develop insight and kind of a shared vision about what you might be able to do with your project. Okay, so next I want to just cover how might we statements, crafting open-ended questions to guide your ideation. So this is a technique to both focus but increase the number of ideas within that focus. So there's a bit of a paradox here, but you'll see why how that plays out. What you want to do is say, hey, we need ideas about this thing. And by writing that how might we statement at the right level, you're going to get a lot of ideas about that thing that's more likely that you're going to have an idea in there that solves it. So I think it was a mathematician, Michael Polanyi, that said, the only way to have a good idea is to have many ideas. But the trick is to focus them. You can't have random ideas all over the place. So in stage 2, you looked broadly at your problem's context. You were saying, let's put down our assumptions and look at everything we can about our problem's context. And you've been developing insights off of that, about people's experience in the context of your project. Now, to prepare for ideation, you need to narrow where you think your problem solving and your ideation can be most productive, while still inspiring a range of ideas. So you're not like, this is the problem, here's the answer, right? It's like, here's our focus that we're focusing on, and let's come up with a lot of ideas so we're more likely to have an idea that we can get through the system and be successful and have it adopted. And we want to prevent slipping back after all this wonderful research into your old ideas, into your old assumptions about how the problem could be solved. So we're connecting our research insights to ideation. How can you use what you are learning to frame ideation? So you better understand people's specific needs and pain points and why things haven't worked in the past. You've done a lot of research, and you can transform your insights into An open-ended statement. There's that phrase again, open-ended. See how we try to be specific and opening things up? A little bit of a paradox, but here's how it works. So we use how might we statements as a driver for our ideation. It's open-minded, but focused questions for brainstorming. So again, you're using insights from your research. I'm going to keep saying that so that you are using the things that you're learning about rather than just randomly saying, coming up with a problem that you haven't really seen in the field. First, you start with the question, how might we? Then you add an action and focus. So for example, how might we provide multiple activities for a person? So who is this for? For people in recovery to achieve an intended outcome, to help rebuild new social habits. So I'm taking this from one of the teams who have talked about working with people in recovery in a peer support network. How might we provide multiple activities for people in recovery so that they can build new social habits? So this one might be a little too broad. I'm not sure. We're going to be talking about narrow to broad in a second, but there's an example. Let's do another one. How might we communicate the benefits of our services to families in the community to attract a higher number of inquiries? So how might we, action, communicate the benefits of our services? To whom? To families in the community. Why? To attract a higher number of inquiries or applications for our services. Another one. How might we make it evident that our facilities are COVID safe? How might we make it evident that our facilities are COVID safe? For who? For patients, so that they are comfortable and confident in coming in for visits. Okay? How might we make it evident that our facilities are COVID safe so patients are comfortable and confident of coming in for visits? Another one. How might we train our staff in giving and receiving everyday feedback so that it becomes part of our culture? And in this one, you can see that the for whom and the action are just switched to make the sentence work better, but the structure or the principle is the same. How might we train our staff in giving and receiving everyday feedback so that it becomes part of our culture? Just some examples from the work we've been doing. So where do you get inspiration for how might we's? You know the answer to this from your work to date, your insights, and the type of information you've been synthesizing from your research. So your topics and subtopic summaries from your open-ended interviews. Remember last week we talked about topics, so you might have an overall theme, you have these 2 or 3 topics, and then you have supporting subtopics. And then considerations. Remember the breast pump project? There was overall categories, subtopics per page, and then considerations. Those become great places to say, this one's a priority, this one's really strong. Let's have ideas about making it easier for breastfeeding mothers to carry, deploy, and pack back up for their pumping on the go, right? So how might we do that? Specific places in the journey map. So look at your journey map. And how might we's will come from some level, some place in that journey map where there's a pain point, things tend to go wrong, there's a lot of stress or things get confused. Conventions and orthodoxies, which we just talked about. This is how this stuff all fits together. So any of these conventions and orthodoxies might spawn a how might we. And remember, you might have seen inspiring examples. So the vacuum cleaner example, and we're going to cover analogies and analogies next week, analogous examples. But from those examples, from those things that you see happening in other industries or outside your organization, might be an inspiration for how might we deploy a network in a different way, blah, 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 right? Okay, so the one thing you want to think about is if it's too broad or too specific. If you make your how might we statement too broad, you'll have ideas that address the problem in different ways. So you might have a lot of ideas, but they'll be firing all over the place and not be really focused on solving one aspect of the problem. And if your how might we statements are too narrow, It will limit ideation and suggest a single solution for that how might we. And you don't want that either. So you want this balance between not too narrow and not too wide. So I have another video, it's a minute and a half that I'm going to play, which she basically sums up what I've been sharing, but I think it's worth hearing again. So let's do this.
How might we statements help us design solutions with a human-centered focus? It is a great way to frame up our design challenges so that our solutions are addressing the right problems. The how might we statement should address the intended action, the primary user, and the desired effect. A recommended format for this sentence would be how might we and describe the intended action, for and describe the primary user, and ending with so that to describe the desired outcome. As an example, let's say in our research we discovered that kids love buying ice cream from a truck, but on a hot day they have trouble bringing it back to their families without it spilling. A good how might we statement in this instance would be, how might we redesign the ice cream buying experience for kids so that it is more portable and less messy? Check that the statements are not too narrow and prescriptive. A good how might we statement allows for a variety of solutions. For example, how might we design a cone to eat ice cream without dripping is too prescriptive. Make sure the statements are not too broad. A good how might we statement allows the solution to have a clear focus. For example, how might we reimagine dessert is too broad and does not force the solution to have the desired effect for the user. Don't worry about it taking too long. You'll need a couple of iterations to get it right.
All right. So that should have made sense. You should have seen the patterns of what we've been talking about. So my last point or your last question might be, I'm really excited to do these how might we's, but how many do I need to do? 1, 2? Well, let's think about it this way. Write a bunch of them. Write a bunch of them inspired by your research, your journey map, your personas, your pain points you've identified, the insight you had about rethinking a convention. So write a bunch of them, maybe 20. I think I wrote 6 here in about 15 minutes for projects that I haven't been working on. So you have a lot more information. So brainstorm a bunch, write them, and that'll help you practice as well. Instead of trying to get the one perfect one, write a bunch of them and throw away with the ones that don't make any sense. Then refine 7 to 10 of them or so. Try to go, hey, out of these 20, maybe these are really interesting. Again, you're doing this as a team, so if each person did 5, you have your 20, right? Or if each person did 7, you have your 20. So refine 7 to 10 of them, and then evaluate amongst the team and use 3 to 5 to focus your sessions when you get there. I know many of you aren't there yet, okay? But when you start ideating, you're gonna just use probably 3 to 4 to get good coverage in your project and keep it narrow enough so that you can move on to prototyping and making something and testing something, okay? So that's the end of week 9 lessons on convention and orthodoxy and how might we.